Hello, and welcome to a very special sleep-deprived episode of the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. Today is the October AMA episode. I am your host, Jesse Firestone, climber, climbing developer, highballer, coach, husband, and about 10 days ago, father. So that's cool. A few people asked me for a general update. It's a bit too early for me to have any grandiose thoughts on fatherhood itself, but I'll tell you a few things that I know, all the same stuff everybody told me pretty much. And then we'll get into the questions after this. First thing, your time management skills will really define your happiness in the early days. I've managed to fit in 2 lifting sessions, 2 climbing sessions, a few extra accessory training sessions, mostly just doing the finger training that I would have done if I had had time to do a full climbing session that day. And then keeping in some of my rehab exercises, things like that. It's not much, but all things considered, I think I'm keeping up pretty well. I don't expect things to get easier necessarily. And yeah, I'll talk more about my projects and my training in a later question. Number 2, sleep when the baby sleeps. That's what everybody says. What they don't tell you is the baby is going to sleep pretty much at the most inconvenient possible time, usually right after I drink espresso. So work in progress there. I've never been a great sleeper, so hopefully this is a chance for me to kind of work my weaknesses a little bit. Number 3, how to put this exactly. I think I've kind of blundered into having a lot of privileges in life, and the most important and most beautiful of those is definitely my marriage, and now getting to share parenthood with my wife. A good relationship is just a shelter against bad times, and when you're awake at 1 a.m. and your baby just pooped into a fresh diaper that you put on them after they pooped in the previous diaper. And now when you're changing that diaper, they start peeing and their pee is running down their back and their pee is all over you. And you're losing your temper a little bit. Having somebody there to shelter you against that is just, it's incredible. And it's incredible to see the other person grow and change with this enigmatic new arrival in your life. So lucky me. Kind of related, number 4, and I guess anybody who pays attention to the world already knows this, but anybody who thinks women can't be in leadership roles or can't be trusted in emotional situations has probably never spent time in a mother-baby care unit in a hospital. In 3 days, we interacted with 1 male doctor, the pediatrician, who was on call. Every other person we interacted with was a woman, and I honestly can't think of a more competent, just professional, patient, positive environment that I've ever been in, really. Our NICU nurse, especially, because when your baby goes to the NICU, that's really stressful, straight from the delivery room to the NICU. And within 30 seconds of talking to the nurse who was in charge of our baby in the NICU, I was like, okay, we're in good hands. This person knows what they're doing. And that's a really powerful feeling, for sure. And number 5, I may never eat Dijon mustard again. And anyone who's had a newborn knows what I'm talking about. And the rest of you live in mustardy, ignorant bliss. All right, let's get to the questions. Just a reminder that these episodes are supported by Patreon. If you want lots of bonus content or you want to ask questions, you can become a patron over at patreon.com/innerfireclimbing. Okay, Simon asks, I've seen you mention a couple of times recommending adopting a Stoic mindset. Can you recommend good practical resources for this? Emphasis on the practical part of this, as I have tried reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius before, but I struggled to pick out the key messages and apply anything. It's a good question. It's hard to get into philosophy, and I think one reasonable criticism of philosophy in general is it's very philosophical. It's much less practical in a lot of cases. And that's why when I'm being high-minded about things, I always try to ground it. Every podcast I've ever been on, my notes have a big, keep it practical at the top. And you'll often hear me give a 6-minute vague answer. And then at the very end, try to wind it back to something people can actually do. But my best advice for something practical and a really good starting point for Stoicism would be William Irvine's book, The Guide to the Good Life, which is going to break down how Stoicism actually works. And so it's sort of a summary, we talk about Stoic philosophy like it's a monolith, but really it spans like hundreds of years and many different progenitors, and there's no agreed upon. It's not like the Bible, where there is sort of a text that we can defer to, and I guess even the Bible has different texts, but something like Stoicism is much broader. Depending on whose stuff you read, you're going to get sort of different takes on how the world works and different takes on how to interact with it. The general tenets are the same, and that's why it's been historically grouped into this one thing, but depending on who you read, it is going to be different, and it's going to have different levels of practicality. So the Guide to the Good Life is a really good starting point, where he's going to sort of go through the things that are in common between all the different Stoic philosophers. And that'll be really helpful. And it also goes through some of the practical stuff like negative visualization and voluntary hardship and some of the actual like things that you can do in order to make Stoic philosophy part of your day-to-day life. Another resource that was good for me when I started out, which isn't around anymore, but you can go back and listen to it, is the Stoic Coffee Break, which is like an old podcast where he would just give like one lesson. I think the episodes were usually like 5 or 15 minutes. And he'll just give like one key lesson from a Stoic. So those are good, like bite-sized things that I enjoyed when that podcast was on the air. And as far as my, once you've done some of the introductory stuff and you've kind of gotten your feet under you, I do think reading the actual texts is helpful. So I would go back to Meditations. And Marcus Aurelius is an emperor. I'm sure you figured that out, but for anybody who's listening who doesn't know, a lot of his Stoic teachings were based on, he was ruling and people would come to him with problems all the time. And so he was a deep thinker, and he would try to solve people's problems in a way that brought them happiness. And he would try to rule in a way that made things better for people. Gosh, that sounds just desperately hopeful right now. Anyways, my personal favorite Stoic is actually Epictetus, who's on the other end of the spectrum. He was a slave. He was born a slave and became a Stoic philosopher and lived most of his life in squalor. And the Enchiridion especially is, I think, a really useful read. I go back and read it probably once a year. And there's just some amazing lessons in there. And I think the duality between the teachings of an emperor and the teachings of a slave is like one of the most impressive and interesting parts of Stoicism to me, because there are so many commonalities, and these two figures lived almost completely different lives. So I think that's really fascinating. And once you've learned the practical stuff, if you still have an interest in the texts, I would definitely read those. I'd also read Seneca's Moral Letters to Lucilius, which is like, I don't even know if they know for sure that Seneca wrote them, but it's a series of letters that was written from him to, I think, one of his old tutors, who maybe was even dead already at the time or something. I forget the exact story, but each letter is on a specific subject. So you can even find letters that are on being in unruly crowds of people. And like when you read the letter, you're going to be like, oh my God, this sounds exactly like when you're at the Boulder and there's like 20 bros. So like it's very directly applicable. You kind of have to hunt through the letters to find the case that you're looking for, but it has been, I've been surprised to find how much of that stuff really applies well to modernity. So got to get over the writing style and everything. And it's definitely, it's not like picking up a thriller book and, reading Dan Brown or whatever, but it's still really worth your time, I think. Okay. Rose asks, what are some of the best exercises for a hypermobile climber, shoulders especially? I think this is a good question. So first of all, we should distinguish between hypermobile in the sense that you're very flexible. Maybe you can pass a Baton or Brighton test, or not pass, I guess. You have a positive Baton or Brighton test. And then there's also like the colloquial, like people saying they're hypermobile, which is like people are just very flexible. So there's like sort of a clinical context, and then there's also like a social context. I don't know if that matters so much in terms of exercise recommendations, but someone who has Ehlers-Danlos or some other clinical hypermobility is, there's other things going on with their body that are going to affect the way they train separately from just the fact that they're quite flexible. And so those are worth being aware of for sure. And if you haven't been screened, it's probably worth screening. You can look up the Baton test, Beighton. That's the old one. And you can also look up the Brighton test. It's really confusing, but that's Brighton. They didn't think that through when they made those tests. I'm sure they're just named after the scientists who came up with them. As far as exercises, to me, I am hypermobile, and I don't think I'm clinically hypermobile. I don't have EDS, but I am technically hypermobile. So the most useful thing for me is like, number one, when I'm training in the end range, I have to be really, really, really careful, because it's just easy for me to go past my end range and cause problems. So I think that's more about ruling out exercises rather than including them. So like if you're truly hypermobile, you probably don't need to do a lot of stretching. And if you are going to stretch, I would stay at maybe 80 to 90% of your range and just feel the muscle at that range. So like as an example, if I bend forward into a pike and I just keep going and going and going, like I can just get to a point where it's going to piss off my lower back. And, I didn't know that was I didn't know that was a sign of everything. I thought everybody could do that for quite a long time. But that doesn't mean that I can't stretch my hamstrings that way. It just means I need to stop, at a reasonable point and just like feel the stretch there and not keep going. So that's, I think, useful. Same thing applies to all the other exercises too, though. Like you want to be careful with doing things like deficit deadlifts, or, if you're going to do pull-ups, like somebody who's truly hypermobile might not want to go all the way into scapular elevation. So like letting your shoulders come up by your ears and like really hanging from the bar, like that could be really useful for somebody who's trying to develop strength at that range. But if they're hypermobile, then you just want to be really mindful about going down into that end range, especially if you have weight hanging from you too, because it can create problems for you where it wouldn't for other people. So I think ruling out some things that are specifically about training end range and then being really careful about the range you train in, those two things are going to be way more important than stressing what exercises you pick. Third thing that I think is important would be, for me personally, I stay more in the 5 to 10 maybe rep range. I don't go down into the 2 to 4 rep range so much, except for maybe on deadlift. And even deadlift, I'll only do that if I've been training it quite a lot. Maybe I would go into that range on pull-ups, but to call back to what I said earlier, like if I was doing a lat pull down or a pull-up and I was going to go into that 2, 3, 4 kind of super heavy rep range, I'm not going to let my shoulders slack all the way at the bottom of the rep. And I'm not going to try to lock it off like as far as I can, because that would probably be painful on the front of my shoulder too. I'm really concerned with the middle of the range of motion and getting a very high amount of muscular recruitment in the middle of the range of motion. That's like that's the highest value for me with the least risk. So I think, focus on those things. Is like, don't do too much stretching unless you're sure what you're doing. Be careful about the range that you train in. And if you are going to go super heavy, train in the middle of the range where you're the strongest and the mobility is going to be the least of a risk. Otherwise, you pick the same exercises as everybody else. You do some pressing, you do some pulling, maybe do a little bit of like accessory shoulder training. Any kind of shoulder training where your shoulders are like not in a super elevated or super protracted position, so relatively neutral, and your arms are bent, probably is going to feel the best. So like one that I really like is the kettlebell halo. Like it's hard for me to, if I have a kettlebell that's relatively challenging, it's just hard for me to do a kettlebell halo and get into any sort of dangerous end range, but I can turn everything on and get a high level of recruitment. So those kind of exercises are what I would look for. And anything where you're moving through a full range of motion and you have like a heavy load on you would be something that I would be really careful with. Sorry for the kind of cagey answer, but if you listen to this podcast, cagey answers are kind of my whole shtick. Okay. Alexander asks, you said in an Instagram post, you don't think 4x4 and arcing trains your technique. Why do you think that? Isn't it a skill to learn how to climb and keep composure when fatigued? So this is a really good question. I feel like I've talked about the psychological impacts of training endurance somewhere on a podcast at some point. But yeah, as far as training endurance in the gym goes, stuff like 4x4s especially, I think the psychological side of things and even the tactical side of things is probably more high value than the endurance side of things for the majority of climbers. If you just look at the durability of the adaptation from a 4x4, I mean, first of all, it's a level of endurance that a lot of boulders probably don't need unless they're climbing quite long, quite powerful, like sustained boulders. It's just very rare for boulders to be like 25 moves. And second of all, the adaptations just don't stick around long enough to be like super high value, the physical adaptations. If you just 4x4 for a few weeks, you're going to get a few weeks worth of endurance. And if you 4x4 for a couple months, you're going to get like maybe a month of endurance, right? It trails off pretty quick. So those psychological adaptations, that ability to have good technique and climb well while you're pumped, that would be the main thing I think that you would be getting from those sort of training exercises. The reason that I don't do them a lot is when you get fatigued, you get those long-term benefits of learning how to climb well while you're tired. But in the short term, the local effect of the exercise is that you get tired and you climb like shit, right? Especially at first when you're learning how to do this. And for most climbers, most of the time, that's just a risk that has very little benefit. Like, what are you getting on the back end? You're maybe learning how to climb while fatigued a little bit, but like we could do that in a calibrated way, and not in like a, sort of shotgun blast way. And I think it would be a lot more valuable. So injecting a little bit of that stuff probably is valuable for most climbers. I've said before, I think if you're a boulderer, the easiest thing would just be to go sport climbing and like have a sport climbing project, learn what it feels like to have a project, learn what it feels like to climb tired, to rehearse a longer sequence, to have to make clips while you're pumped and stuff. Like I think that's going to be way more valuable than doing 4x4s personally, because all the psychological stuff, the tactical stuff, the technical stuff is going to apply back to bouldering directly. Whereas if you're mostly a boulderer, you mostly do normal length boulders, you're going to go do 4x4s, you're going to get super tired, you're going to climb like ass in that session. You're going to learn a little bit of the psychological side of endurance. And then as soon as you stop doing it, that's it. It's like the effects kind of peter off. And like, I don't see the point of taking on that risk and taking on that fatigue unless you have a good reason to do it. I think there are better ways to get those same gains. And by the way, I've done a lot of 4x4s and a lot of arcing, and I think they had value for me for sure. It's just a question of when you put that stuff in and being sure that, you train it at the right intensity and stuff. So good question though, even if you did lead the witness a little bit, but I do happen to agree with you, so I'll allow it. Okay. Andrew asks, any tips on the best way to use a leg curl machine for rehab and or heel hook training? Thoughts on single versus double leg, how often to program it? Any ideas on how to make the movement more specific to open hip heel hooks? Okay, this is great. I did just rehab a chronic hamstring sprain over the last year or so. So the best way to use a leg curl machine for rehab or heel hook training would just be to use a leg curl machine and go hard on it, do multiple working sets, go within a couple reps of failure. And, it's strength training. So like any other strength training exercise, 3 sets of 6 to 8, 5 sets of 5, those kind of rep ranges would be good. Single leg versus double leg, there's really no reason to do it single legged, in my opinion, unless you're just checking to see if you have a significant deficit. We're talking 30% maximum voluntary contraction difference. And if it's closer than that, you should just do double because of a thing called bilateral facilitation, which basically means when you use both legs are going to try a little bit harder than they would if you were just using one leg, which means your total recruitment is going to be higher, and that just makes it higher value. Also, it's going to cut the length of your session in half to do double leg versus single. And I mean, all of us are on this earth for a short time. So you really want to do two separate leg curl sessions, or do you want to just do one? As far as how often, that just depends on your total training load and how much space you have. Like if you were doing a lot of gym bouldering or Northwest Granite style bouldering, and you're working your hamstrings really hard, then you probably wouldn't want to do it twice a week. But in general, once or twice a week is probably fine. And then on any ideas how to make the movement more specific to open hip heel hooks. So if you want to have stability especially in your knee, when you're doing an externally rotated heel hook, you probably want to do a little bit of hip external rotation, abduction, adduction, and maybe internal rotation training. So I'll throw out some examples like Copenhagen plank, side lying hip abduction, and then maybe doing hamstring curls lying on the ground with a band, doing them isometrically with a band so that you do have your hip needs to be stable. Those things are going to be much lower recruitment than a leg curl machine, but I think they do still have value. They certainly had value for me because I think part of the reason I was straining my hip was just because my pattern on that leg when my hip would get super open. My adductors were like not doing the work that they probably should have on that side. And so I needed to like kind of rework some of those patterns and get a little bit, I don't want to say more stable because it's all strength in the end, but yeah, it felt like I needed to get a little more stable. As far as training and rehab, I think one exercise that I've talked about a lot on Instagram and I give to a lot of people is just a lying elevated hip extension. So you could think of this like a single leg glute bridge, but you put the leg up on a bench and then I'll hold a kettlebell on the hip bone. So your other leg is free in the air. It's like planking. And you can do this with your toe on the bench, which is going to feel a little bit more in your calf, or you can do it with your heel on the bench, which is going to feel a little bit more in your hamstring. And then you can also play with like how close your butt is to the bench. So as your butt gets closer, you're going to be in more knee flexion. As your butt gets further away, you're going to be in, your knee is going to be more extended and it's going to be a little bit more intense on your hamstring. And then the other thing you can play with is externally rotating that hip. So pointing your kneecap instead of pointing straight up, having your kneecap point a little bit over to the side that leg is on. And that can get intense fast on the like lateral and medial side of the knee. So I wouldn't do more than like 10 to 20 degrees of external rotation, but I have found that's a good general trainer for heel hooking. And it's something I do in my warm up almost every climbing day, especially if I'm climbing outside. It feels very preparatory for heel hooks. So the main components of my rehab were the leg curl machine, the hip abduction, a couple other special exercises for me, and then a lot of those lying hip extensions with like a 53-pound kettlebell. I'll do them as repeaters, by the way. I didn't say that. I'll do like 3 reps of holding it for 7 or 10 seconds with like a couple seconds off in between. And then I'll do like 3 to 4 sets of that. And that felt like that was pretty good rehab for me. Okay. Max asks, got two different Maxes this month. Max asks, how are you thinking about your projects and training now that you're a dad, sling blade, Penrose, etc.? Kind of a huge question, and I'm only 2 weeks into being a dad. So I think the main thing I'm doing is what I always do, which is I'm trying to kind of stick to my priorities from two ends of the spectrum. So anytime you're doing training, you can do what you call a needs and demands analysis for the athlete, which is basically like figuring out what is it that this athlete needs in order to succeed, and then where are they at, and like sort of what are the gaps between those two things, and then based on that you can kind of work backwards and figure out what it makes the most sense to train. Because they're going to have most athletes, most of the time, they're going to have a lot of gaps between where they are and where they want to be, and they're not going to be able to address all those things at the same time. But the needs analysis sort of lets you figure out like what the highest priority things are. So for me, like, for the next couple months, I think just lifting and climbing on my board and just making sure that I do a lot of those things is the most important thing. And like any kind of specificity for my projects is very secondary to those. Like if I maintain my general conditioning, so if I keep my cardio up and I lift, once or twice a week, that is going to make sure that I can do good training later and have good, general climbing sessions. So that's a huge priority for me. I'm at a point in my climbing where I have enough climbing skill that like specific training doesn't feel as important to be doing, at this phase of the off season. I have quite a few months before I really try either of those projects. So we'll see. But yeah, as I get closer to getting on either of those things, I probably will do slightly more specific training. And actually I tried the teacup last week as well, which for those who aren't from around Leavenworth, it's just another V13. Sling Blade's a V13 that I've tried quite a bit, and then Penrose is a V14 that I've tried just a little bit. And of those 3 problems, the teacup's actually the one that's probably the most similar to the angle and size of my board. So I'll be curious to see if just climbing on my board more improves my general strength for the teacup. Is interesting to climb on it and kind of feel it out, because I last really tried it in 2021. And at that time I did have a home wall. I was living in Bend and I had a home wall through COVID, and I felt a little stronger on some of the moves in 2021, but I felt stronger on the crux move specifically this year. I think just because my fingers have continued to get stronger, and I could put a little more force through the crux hold. So I'm not thinking about my training in a hyper specific way. I'm thinking about it in a more general way, and I'm already kind of starting to think about like how I can think less about my training and still make some progress on some projects. So that's why the pivot to the teacup is kind of like an interesting idea to me, because I'll probably try it in early spring. And if I'm like, okay, I did this specific, quote, specific training for Sling Blade, for the endurance or whatever for Sling Blade, because it's very long. But I might still come out of the training season feeling better on the teacup just because I've been climbing on a really steep board a lot all winter. Like that might be more valuable than any specific training. And in my own climbing these days, I tend to try to turn that stuff to my advantage more than doing super ornate, like kind of training plans where I really dial in on one thing. I tend to think more like, where do I have a natural advantage? Like, what have I been doing that I can use next? Or what do I have in my arsenal right now that makes sense to pick a project based on that firepower? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it generally. I guess specifically for the two problems that Max mentioned, Sling Blade, I think I can do all the moves. I don't think I have any problems with that. The main limiters on that for me are just the conditions window is quite short. So I need to be fit in that window, and that's really challenging. That does require some specific training. And then the main thing I need in that window is endurance. Like I need to build some of that on the problem, just because there's, specific things that are very hard to train outside of the problem, I think. But I think just coming in with a higher session capacity and a higher level of strength endurance would be really valuable for that problem. Maybe it's something that I'll talk about, in a more like detailed way for like a solo podcast or something, just because I have thought about training for it quite a lot, but I don't know if it makes sense for me to go super deep on it right now while I have dad brain and I'm sleeping 5 hours a day and stuff like that. So, and then as far as Penrose, my main limiter on Penrose is definitely just my finger strength. I think I've talked about it on the pod before, but it's basically two really hard moves into like a V10 or 11. I think the top part, I just need time on the problem to learn. It's tricky to work because it's quite tall. But I think the upper boulder, the easier boulder, will suit me. And then the first two moves, I have sort of done chunks of them. I definitely haven't linked them, and I definitely haven't done either of them in a complete fashion, but I've done like the first chunk of the move, or I've done the move with a different grip than I can get into it, things like that. So it's like I haven't quite linked it. And I just think having stronger fingers is actually probably the biggest thing. And time on the problem is going to help me get the positions better, and then I'll use less finger strength. So that'll definitely help. But I think just coming into it with slightly stronger fingers than I have now is probably really high value. And the biggest gains that I've ever made in my finger strength, other than when I was kind of a beginner, the first like 8-10 years or so, the biggest gains I've made have been when I got my first home wall, living in Bend. Just climbing on that board and climbing around Bend was really, really good for my fingers. So I'm kind of anticipating that the same thing will happen. The board I have now is steeper. I've got a lot of small holds on that board, and I'm very good at doing the low gear style training now. I can really, really milk that style of training. So I do anticipate and kind of hope that my fingers are going to keep getting stronger. And I think that might be all I need for Penrose, but it still could be a couple year process. So that's how I'm thinking about my training now that I'm a dad, insofar as I am thinking about it at all. Okay, Jantina asks, something I've struggled with this season is navigating outdoor sport climbing sessions with someone who climbs much harder than me, especially given that they aren't my regular climbing partner. My goal is generally for both of us to have a session that is enjoyable and appropriately challenging. Strategies that have led to satisfying sessions include going to crags that we're familiar with and working on the same routes at grades that are engaging on-site or flash level for them and quick red points for me. Okay, so your climbing level is not that far off if you can do that. That's not more than a number grade, I would say, with the advantages of seeing their beta and having the draws already hung. However, I often feel implicit or explicit pressure to structure sessions around their hard projects. Usually this means mostly belaying all day and squeezing in rushed attempts on easier routes nearby when they need to rest. If there are no easier routes nearby, I've been encouraged to just top rope their project, which can be frustrating when the moves are hard or impossible for me. What advice do you have about managing outdoor sport climbing sessions for climbers with very different levels of ability and experience? I always appreciate that Jantina offers all this context, and then the final question is like very well summarized, and I'm like, shit, I could have just read that last part. But great question. Something that I have dealt with myself as well. I have a memory of going climbing with someone at Smith. I won't name names, but a really strong Smith climber, and we didn't talk about what we wanted to get out of the day. And so at the time I was like projecting 13A, 13B at Smith, and I had done a lot of the 12 minuses, and it quickly became apparent like this person was just hiking all the 12s and 13s and was like kind of annoyed that we weren't going to get in like 10 or 12 pitches at that level, because I was just flailing to try to top rope up some of these 13s that I'd never tried before. And yeah, it was a frustrating day, but it was mainly a frustrating day because we didn't do a good job of establishing the expectations for what the day would be like up front. And I think if we had done that, it would have been more productive. I did climb with that person other times, and we had much better days because we either went places where they had more to do, or just set a clear, I was clear, like I'm only going to get 6 pitches in today. I need to be home by 2 p.m. or whatever. And then, they don't need to stress about their like assumption that we're going to do a turbo high volume day. So I think managing expectations is always really important to avoid frustration or other mental strains. As far as like specifically what to do, so I think picking crags where you could you could red point stuff and they could flash or onsite, that's a good call. And like I said during the question, I think you guys are probably not that far off if you can do that. I have clients, friends and clients in Europe where like one person's climbing 9A or 14D, and their climbing partner is climbing like 13A or 13B, and those people are finding crags that they can climb at together, even if that means like one person gets the first few hours and gets a couple tries on their project, and then you go to a different crag and the other person gets a few tries on their project. I think as you get into harder and harder projects, you want to try them less during the day, during a climbing day. So like maybe earlier on, you can give like 3 red point tries on something, or maybe 4, and then like later it's like 2 and sometimes even 1. So I think as you get more offset, it becomes more about just making sure the person gets their really high value, like attempt or 2, and then focusing on the other person, which is less like climbing together and more like you're supporting them and then they're supporting you. And those two things are kind of separate. And, speaking for my own experience, like with my partner, we haven't sport climbed in quite a while, but if we did sport climb, I think we'd be at very different levels. And so I think we would have to do something like that, either going to different crags or going to crags that have a wide variety of difficulty. Like Smith Rock is really good for that. There's like crags where there's 512 right next to 514. That's not unusual there. And then, yeah, I guess my last note, I'm not sure how helpful any of this is, but my last note is probably, I do think, the just top rope, that is really frustrating advice coming from someone who's like having you get on something that's way beyond your pay grade. But I do think with sport climbing, there's a meta skill with sport climbing, which I think we don't talk about enough. And that's your ability to just commute up a route. So for instance, if I went out to try like a 514, and even if someone didn't put a top rope on it, if I was leading it, which is probably more likely, but even if someone did put a top rope on it, my first time up it, I'm really just like trying to get a sense of like, what is this route like? Where are the bolts? Are there holds? Where are the hard parts? Where are the easy parts? Do I enjoy being on the wall here? Is it like going to be stressful to be on the wall here? What's the hang like? Can I hear my belayer? There's like so many things that need to be sussed out and learned and can be learned without even trying to do the moves. So if it's really that high above your pay grade, kind of consider it as it's like a recon mission, and the goal is not even to do the moves necessarily, but it's more just to get up the wall and just experience something that's super hard. And we mostly think about climbing in a context of like, I am trying to get to the top of this thing as fast as I can, like in as few sessions or tries as I can. But there's aspects of that. There's skills included in that don't have anything to do with the actual red point and the actual moves. There's just a lot to be learned. So if you watch super skilled sport climbers getting on a project for the first time, you might be shocked at like how much they're French freeing it, how much they're cheating, yanking on the rope, clipping up, like all that stuff is fair game. And if you over index on that stuff, if you use that stuff too much, you miss out on like how it feels to just try to confidently move through moves that are too hard for you. But if you don't use those kind of cheats and those commuting options at all, then you're going to be really, You're going to be really inefficient when you're on terrain that's above your kind of level. And as you get better at projecting, you're always going to be on terrain that's above your level, because every time you try a new project, it's going to feel really, really hard. So yeah, I don't know how helpful that is, other than maybe just try to take what they're saying in a less critical light, or like try not to take it too hard and just treat it as an opportunity. Probably not something if they're just trying route after route after route that's too hard for you, and they're like too lazy to walk to a different area so you can try something else, then that's going to be super annoying. But maybe like once a climbing day with that person, just be like, yeah, screw it, I'll get on something that's like 2 or 3 grades harder than I've ever tried, and I probably won't do any of the moves, but I will know what that route's like, and when I come back to try it in a couple of years, I'm going to know a little bit more than I otherwise would, and that does have some value. So there's some thoughts on that. Okay, Max number 2 asks, how would you prepare for a major life change that probably has a lot of stress and discomfort? For me, moving to a megacity and starting a new job without being fully committed. I thought about trying to cut my volume by 25 to 30% in the month leading up to the change and keep this as long as I feel comfortable in the situation. I just want to increase my capacity to buffer the stress and make sure I don't get injured. Got it. Okay. Maybe you thought about something like this in regards to the birth of your child. And following up on this, do you have any ideas regarding mindset? E.g., how could I try not to be performance focused, or even get myself to not want to perform in that time, or just get myself to do less, even though it might seem like a good idea to get my head cleared up by bouldering? Okay, I think the idea of cutting your volume to make space for life stress is I think that's a really smart idea and very thoughtful, very introspective. I would probably do that at the move and not before the move, unless the month leading up to the move is itself stressful, like with logistics and packing your stuff. If that stuff is all feeling stressful to you, then cutting your volume probably makes sense. But otherwise, I think the stressful part is going to be actually being in the new city, and actually like acclimating to a new environment. Like that's the part where I think I would do the volume cut or the deload, and that's wherever the stress is highest, that's where you're going to want to reduce the amount of strain that you're putting on your body physically. And as far as the birth of my child, I mean, I think I did almost the exact opposite of you. I stopped training completely, and I just climbed as much as I possibly could. I fit in every climbing session that I could, even though I was really busy getting stuff ready and unpacking things and painting a nursery and all that. I made space as often as I possibly could to go climb and train, because I knew that time was going to be the one thing that I didn't feel like I had for a few months. And I think that worked out really well. I mean, I'm super lucky. My wife is very cool, and she understands how important climbing is to me. So I have time and space to keep training and climbing a little bit, but I just didn't know what things would be like. And I took advantage of the fall days as much as I could, and I think that was a really smart move for me. So there's kind of always two sides to the coin, and I think having your first kid is probably a little bit different than moving to a new city. On the mindset thing, I mean, having an ability to control your output and sort of modulate how hard you're going to try on a given day, and modulate what it is you're actually going to do in the gym on a given day, those things have a lot of value. And that's actually one of the most important reasons that I think everybody should do. Well, not everybody, but it's not a bad idea for everybody to do some training at some point, because it helps you just sort of engage with, okay, what am I going to do when I go to the gym today? What is the plan? And it gets you out of that mode where it's just like, I go to the gym, I do the same warm up, I try to project the new set, just like this hammering the same thing over and over and over. Doing some kind of training helps you get out of that. And when you get out of it, you develop like an ability to modulate what it is that the goal of the day is. And that makes it easier when you have something like this going on to just be like, okay, the goal of the day is to go have fun, or the goal of the day is to try hard, but I'm only going to do it for 30 minutes. You just get some control over yourself and over what you do in the session. I think that's a very, very important skill to develop. And kind of on that same note, I think, one thing that you may find really useful with your life change, especially if you're in a big city, I don't know what city it is or how many climbing gyms they have, but one of the most important things with moving is your social scene, and like feeling like you have a world of people around you. And I think bouldering can be really helpful for that. But if you're really like blindered and like zoomed in on your performance or on like climbing. If you just like go to the new gym in the new city and you go straight to the board and start projecting stuff on the board, like you might make some friends doing that. But if it were me, I would be like, I wouldn't even be trying to climb less. I would probably be trying to spend more total time at the climbing gym, but climb as little as I could over that time. And I would be very pro-social and be trying to like make friends and just learn what that city is like and stuff. Because climbing is an incredible way to meet people. Like I had so much more social anxiety and such a harder time making friends before I started climbing. And then since I've started climbing, I feel like I always have friends everywhere I go, unless it's like a city where there's no climbing at all. There's always a shared experience and a shared communication and all these things that you get from climbing that make it really special. So I hope you find that helpful, and good luck with your move. Okay, looks like that is all the questions for the October 2025 edition. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions, everybody. And I will chat to you all again in about a month for the November edition. So if you want to ask questions on these AMAs, as always, patreon.com/innerfireclimbing. And I am always available coachjfire@gmail.com and @coachjfire on Instagram. Always welcome your messages and feedback. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.